My daughter called me a burden. While quietly spending $23,000 of my money, I ended it with one call that she never saw coming. The notification sound on my phone cut through the quiet afternoon like a knife. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, the one Margaret had picked out 15 years ago when we still thought we had forever ahead of us. The leather was worn now, molded to the shape of a man who'd spent too many evenings alone since the cancer took her. I reached for my phone expecting maybe a weather alert or one of those spam calls about my car's extended warranty. Instead, I saw a text from my daughter Sarah. My heart lifted the way it always did when I heard from her. At 68, you learn to treasure every connection with your children, especially when they live 3 states away with their own busy lives. I opened the message with the kind of smile that comes automatically when you're about to hear from someone you love. The words hit me like a physical blow. Dad, I need you to understand something. You're becoming a burden on our family. The constant calls, the surprise visits, the way you expect us to drop everything whenever you need help. It's too much. We have our own lives to live. I read it again, certain I'd misunderstood. Then, a third time. Each word carved itself deeper into my chest with every reading. A burden. That's what my only child thought of me. The man who'd worked double shifts for 20 years to pay for her college, who'd walked her down the aisle with tears streaming down my face because I was so proud, who'd babysit her kids every weekend when money was tight and childcare was expensive. My hands started shaking as I scrolled up through our recent conversations. There it was, spread out like evidence in a case I didn't want to solve. 3 weeks ago, I'd called to ask if she could help me figure out why my internet wasn't working. 2 weeks before that, I'd stopped by unannounced when I was in her neighborhood, just hoping to see the grandkids for a few minutes. Last month, I'd asked her to come with me to a doctor's appointment because the medical terms confused me, and I wanted someone there who could understand what the doctors were saying. Each memory felt different now, tainted by the knowledge of how she'd apparently interpreted my requests. What I'd thought was normal family interaction, she'd seen as neediness. What felt like staying connected to the people I loved most, she'd experienced as burden. The phone buzzed again, another message from Sarah. I know this sounds harsh, but someone needs to be honest with you. Mom always handled these conversations, but she's not here anymore. You can't expect Jessica and me to fill that void. We're not responsible for your loneliness. Jessica, my daughter-in-law. I wondered how many conversations they'd had about me behind closed doors. How many times they'd discussed the problem of Dad and his constant intrusions into their perfect suburban life. The grandfather who apparently asked for too much, gave too little, and had somehow transformed from family patriarch into family burden. I set the phone down on the coffee table and stared at it like it might suddenly display different words. Around me, the house felt impossibly quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the hollow silence of a space where someone used to live and laugh and fill the rooms with warmth. Margaret's reading glasses still sat on the end table beside me. Her bookmark still marked page 143 of the novel she'd never finish. For 2 years since her funeral, I'd been trying to figure out how to be a person instead of half of a couple. How to make decisions without running them past the woman who'd been my partner for 41 years. How to cook dinner for one person when every recipe in the house was designed for 2. How to fall asleep in a bed that felt cavernous without her warmth beside me. I'd thought staying close to Sarah and her family was the answer. They were my connection to the future, my reason to keep going when grief made every day feel like walking through wet cement. But apparently, that connection had become a chain around their necks. The third text arrived while I was still processing the first 2. Also, Dad, we need to talk about the credit card situation. The family account you gave me for emergencies has been getting a lot of use lately. Jessica's been using it for groceries and gas, and honestly, it's become part of our monthly budget. We really appreciate your generosity, but we wanted to make sure you're okay with how we've been using it. There it was, the credit card I'd given Sarah 3 years ago when her husband lost his job. Just for emergencies, I'd said, until you get back on your feet. But David had found new work within 6 months. That was 2.5 years ago. And according to my online banking, that card had seen $4,700 in charges just this month. Groceries, gas, restaurants, shopping trips, a weekend getaway to the mountains, new clothes for the kids, the kind of expenses that normal families budget for with their own income. But why budget when Dad's credit card could cover it? Why live within your means when someone else was apparently happy to subsidize your lifestyle? I pulled out my laptop and logged into my bank account, something I'd been avoiding for weeks because I knew the numbers would be depressing. The credit card statement loaded slowly, line by line, revealing the scope of what had apparently become my involuntary contribution to their household expenses. Whole Foods, $234. Target, $189. Shell Station, $67. Nordstrom, $312. Colorado Mountain Resort, $845. Each charge felt like a small betrayal, but together they painted a picture that made my stomach turn. I was being used. Not maliciously, maybe, but systematically. The emergency credit card had become a convenience account. The man they considered a burden was also their private ATM, funding a lifestyle they couldn't afford on their own salaries while complaining about how much attention he required. I scrolled through 6 months of statements, adding up numbers that grew larger and more painful with each calculation. $8,000, $12,000, $18,000, $23,000 in 6 months, charged to the emergency account of a retired man living on Social Security and pension payments. The phone buzzed again. Sarah's name on the screen, but this time it was a call instead of a text. I stared at it, letting it ring while I tried to process everything I'd learned in the past 10 minutes. My daughter thought I was a burden. My son-in-law and daughter-in-law were spending my money like it was their own. The family I'd been trying so hard to stay connected to had been discussing me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. The call went to voicemail. A few seconds later, the notification appeared. I played it back, hearing Sarah's voice take on that particular tone she used when she was trying to manage a difficult situation. "Hi, Dad. I just wanted to make sure you got my messages. I know they might have sounded a little harsh, but I really think we need to have an honest conversation about boundaries. You know I love you, but things have gotten a little overwhelming lately. Also, about the credit card thing, we can definitely scale back if money's tight. We just assumed since you never mentioned it that everything was fine. Anyway, call me back when you get this." Scale back if money's tight, as if the issue was my financial situation rather than their assumption that my money was theirs to spend. As if the problem was my inability to afford their lifestyle rather than their decision to live beyond their means using someone else's resources. I sat in Margaret's chair, surrounded by the evidence of my own foolishness. Bank statements showing months of excessive spending, text messages calling me a burden, voicemails offering to scale back their use of my money as if they were doing me a favor. The grandfather who'd been trying so hard to stay relevant in his family's lives that he'd apparently become nothing more than a financial resource they could tap whenever convenient. Margaret would have seen through this immediately. She'd always been better at reading people, better at setting boundaries, better at knowing when kindness was being mistaken for weakness. "Tom," she would have said, "they're taking advantage of you and you're letting them because you're afraid of being alone." She would have been right. The fear of losing what little family connection I had left had made me blind to what that connection actually was. Not love, not respect, not genuine care for my well-being. Just the comfortable assumption that Dad would always be there to pay for things and absorb their frustrations while asking for nothing in return except the privilege of not being completely cut off. I closed the laptop and picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number for my bank. Customer service hours until 6 p.m. It was 4:30, plenty of time to make the call that would change everything. But first, I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee using Margaret's favorite mug, the one with the faded flowers that she'd bought at a craft fair 20 years ago. I sat at the table where we'd planned our retirement, where we'd discussed our hopes for watching grandchildren grow up, where we'd imagined growing old together surrounded by family who loved us. Those dreams felt like they belonged to different people now. People who hadn't yet learned that love could be conditional, that generosity could be mistaken for weakness, that trying to buy your place in someone's life was a losing game from the very beginning. I picked up my phone and dialed the bank's customer service number, listening to the automated menu options while I sipped coffee from a dead woman's mug and prepared to teach my daughter what it meant to call someone a burden. The representative answered on the third ring. First National Bank Customer Service, this is Jennifer. How can I help you today? I need to cancel a credit card, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, effective immediately. I can help you with that, Mr. Henderson, Jennifer said, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who handled account cancellations all day long. Can I get the last 4 digits of the card you'd like to cancel? I rattled off the numbers from memory, 4 digits that represented 2.5 years of what I'd mistaken for family emergencies. That's card ending in 3847, issued to Sarah Henderson as an authorized user on your account. Is there a specific reason for the cancellation today? The card is being misused, I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. Strange because they were true, but I'd never allowed myself to think them before. I need it canceled immediately, and I need to know if there are any pending charges. The sound of typing filled the brief silence. Let me pull up your account details, Mr. Henderson. I see there are 3 pending charges that haven't posted yet. One from this morning at Starbucks for $12.47, one from yesterday at Amazon for $89.99, and one from Sunday at Costco for $236.12. Sunday. 2 days after she'd texted me about being a burden, Sarah had spent over $200 on my credit card at Costco. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so crushing. I was apparently too much trouble to maintain a normal relationship with, but not too much trouble to subsidize their bulk shopping trips. Cancel the card now, I said, and decline those pending charges. I can certainly cancel the card effective immediately, sir, but the pending charges will likely still process since they were authorized before the cancellation. However, you could dispute them if they weren't authorized purchases. They weren't authorized. Not really. Not when authorization had been given for emergencies 3 years ago and had somehow evolved into funding their regular lifestyle expenses. But explaining that to Jennifer would require telling a stranger that my own daughter had been systematically taking advantage of my loneliness and generosity. Just cancel the card, I said instead, and send me written confirmation. Absolutely, Mr. Henderson. The card is now canceled and deactivated. Sarah Henderson will no longer be able to make purchases on this account. Is there anything else I can help you with today? Actually, yes. I need to set up account alerts for any attempts to use canceled cards, and I want to review all authorized users on all my accounts. More typing. I see you have one other authorized user, a David Henderson, on your checking account. He has debit card access, but hasn't used it in several months. Would you like to review that authorization as well? David. My son-in-law who'd been out of work for 6 months 3 years ago. The man I'd added to my checking account so he could buy groceries for his family when pride prevented him from asking for direct handouts. Another emergency measure that had never been revoked once the emergency passed. Remove him, I said. Remove all authorized users from all accounts except my own access. I can do that, Mr. Henderson. This will take effect immediately, and all associated cards will be deactivated. The account holders will be notified by mail within 3 business days. 3 business days. Sarah would discover her credit card didn't work long before she received official notification. She'd try to buy gas or groceries, and the card would be declined. She'd call the store, call the bank, and eventually call me. The conversation we'd have then would be very different from the ones we'd been having. Thank you, Jennifer. That's everything. You're welcome, Mr. Henderson. Have a great day. I hung up and sat in the kitchen silence, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of clarity that came with taking action instead of just absorbing whatever treatment people decided to give you. For 2 years, I'd been drifting through widowhood like a man walking through fog, accepting whatever scraps of attention or affection came my way because I was terrified of being completely alone. But there were worse things than being alone. Being used was worse. Being taken for granted was worse. Being called a burden by people who had no problem burdening your bank account was definitely worse. My phone buzzed with another text from Sarah. Dad, are you okay? You haven't called back and I'm starting to worry. I know my messages were pretty direct, but I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. Can we talk tonight? Starting to worry. About what? That her personal ATM might be malfunctioning? That the man she'd called a burden might actually start acting like one by removing himself from her financial life? I set the phone aside without responding and walked to Margaret's desk in the corner of the living room. She'd kept all our important papers organized in neat folders, labeled in her careful handwriting. Insurance policies, investment statements, Social Security documentation, the deed to the house, everything a widow might need to understand her financial situation. I'd been avoiding this desk for months, but tonight felt like the right time to face reality. The investment account statements told a story I'd been ignoring. Margaret and I had been careful savers, putting away money for 41 years of marriage. We'd planned for retirement, for medical expenses, for the possibility that one of us might need long-term care. What we hadn't planned for was one of us subsidizing an adult child's lifestyle for years after the other parent died. $23,000 in 6 months. If that pace continued, I'd spend over $40,000 a year on Sarah's family expenses. Money that was supposed to last me through retirement, through whatever medical issues might arise, through the possibility of needing assisted living or in-home care as I aged. Money I'd need if I wanted to maintain any independence in my later years. Instead, it was going toward organic groceries and weekend getaways for people who considered my emotional needs burdensome, but apparently had no problem with my financial contributions to their comfort. I pulled out a calculator and started working through numbers that should have been obvious months ago. At the current rate of spending, combined with my normal living expenses, I'd run through our savings in less than 8 years. Margaret and I had planned for me to live comfortably for at least 20 years after retirement, but that was before I'd started funding a second household without realizing it. The really painful part was discovering how unnecessary it all was. David's income, combined with Sarah's part-time work, should have been plenty to cover their basic expenses. They lived in a nice house in a good neighborhood, drove reliable cars, had health insurance through David's job. The credit card wasn't covering survival needs. It was covering lifestyle upgrades they couldn't afford on their own. My phone rang. Sarah again. This time I answered, curious to see how she'd approach the conversation after sending those text messages. "Dad, thank goodness. I was starting to think something had happened to you." "I'm fine," I said, settling back into Margaret's chair. "Just processing some things. Look, about those texts earlier. I probably could have been more tactful, but I really think we need to establish some better boundaries. It's not that we don't love you, but Jessica and I have been talking, and we feel like maybe you're becoming too dependent on us for emotional support. Too dependent." The woman who'd spent over $4,000 on my credit card this month was lecturing me about dependency. "I see," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "And what kind of boundaries did you have in mind?" "Well, maybe calling before you visit instead of just showing up. And perhaps limiting phone calls to once or twice a week unless it's a real emergency. And maybe finding some activities or hobbies that don't involve us, Like joining a seniors group or taking a class or something. Join a seniors group, take a class, find hobbies that don't involve my family." All reasonable suggestions, except they were coming from someone who apparently viewed our relationship as entirely one-sided. I was supposed to need less from them while they continued taking whatever they wanted from me. "Those sound like reasonable boundaries," I said, and I could hear the relief in Sarah's voice. "Oh, good, I'm so glad you understand. I was worried you might take it personally." "Actually, I've been thinking about boundaries too," I said. "In fact, I implemented some of my own today." "Oh, what kind of boundaries?" I could hear wariness creeping into her voice, the tone of someone who sensed a conversation shifting in an unexpected direction. "I canceled your credit card," I said simply, "and removed David's access to my checking account. I realized I needed better financial boundaries." The silence stretched so long I thought the call might have dropped. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice had changed completely. "You what? Dad, that card is for emergencies. What if something happens with the kids? What if our car breaks down?" "Then you'll handle it the same way every other family handles emergencies," I said, "with your own resources, or by asking for help instead of just taking it." "Taking it? Dad, you gave us that card. You said we could use it when we needed help. I gave you a card for emergencies 3 years ago when David was unemployed. David's been working for 2.5 years. When exactly did your weekend mountain trips become emergencies?" Another long silence. When she spoke again, her voice had an edge I'd rarely heard directed at me. "Have you been monitoring our spending? That's pretty invasive, Dad." Invasive. I was being invasive for reviewing my own credit card statements. The same woman who'd called me a burden was now offended that I'd noticed she was spending my money. "Sarah," I said, feeling calmer than I'd felt in months, "I've spent over $23,000 on that card in the past 6 months. I'm 78 years old, living on a fixed income, and trying to make my savings last through retirement. Did you really think I wasn't going to notice?" $23,000. The number hung in the air between us like an accusation. I could hear Sarah's breathing on the other end of the line, the kind of careful, measured breathing people do when they're trying to control their reaction to something they weren't prepared to face. "Dad, I had no idea it was that much," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "I mean, we weren't keeping track of every little purchase. It's not like we were buying luxury items or anything. $845 at Colorado Mountain Resort isn't a luxury item." "That was for the kids' spring break. They needed some family time after David's work stress, and we thought—" "You thought you'd use my money to pay for it without asking." The defensive tone crept back into her voice. "You never said there was a limit on the card. You never said we couldn't use it for family expenses." Family expenses. I rubbed my forehead, feeling the beginning of a headache that had nothing to do with eye strain and everything to do with the realization that my daughter had developed an entirely different understanding of what constituted an emergency than the man paying for them. "Sarah, when I gave you that card, your husband was unemployed and you were struggling to buy groceries. That was 3 years ago. David has a good job now. You're both working. At what point did you plan to stop treating my credit card as part of your monthly budget?" "It's not like that, Dad. We appreciate everything you do for us, but you make it sound like we're taking advantage of you." The words came out before I could stop them. "Aren't you?" Silence. Not the thoughtful kind where someone is considering what you've said, but the shocked kind where someone has been confronted with a truth they weren't expecting to face. "That's not fair," she said finally. "We never asked you to give us that card. You offered it because you wanted to help. And now you're making us feel guilty for accepting help from family." "Yira? Help and taking are two different things. Help is when someone asks for assistance with a specific need. Taking is when someone uses your resources as their own without checking if that's still okay." I could hear muffled voices in the background. David, probably, wondering why his wife was having such an intense phone conversation. I imagined him asking what was wrong, imagining Sarah covering the phone to whisper that Dad was being difficult about money. True. "Look," Sarah said, her voice taking on the patient tone she used with her children when they were being unreasonable. "I think you're overreacting to this whole thing. Yes, we've used the card more than we originally planned, but it's not like we're buying boats or taking trips to Europe. These are normal family expenses that we would have managed on our own if we had to." "Then manage them on your own." "What?" "If they're expenses you would have managed on your own anyway, then manage them on your own. The card is canceled. Problem solved." The patient tone disappeared. "Dad, you can't just cancel our emergency card without warning. What if something really does happen? What if one of the kids gets hurt and we need to pay for medical expenses? What if our car breaks down and we can't afford repairs? Then you'll call and ask for help like adults do, instead of just charging whatever you need to someone else's credit card? This is ridiculous. You're punishing us for accepting help that you offered." I stood up from Margaret's chair and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden she'd planted before she got sick. The roses were blooming despite my neglect, hardy enough to survive without constant attention. Unlike some relationships, apparently. "Sarah, let me ask you something. In your text message today, you called me a burden. You said I expect you to drop everything whenever I need help, that my constant calls and visits are too much for your family to handle. Do you remember saying that?" "Yes, but how many times have I called you in the past month?" Silence. "How many times have I asked you to drop everything to help me?" More silence. "I'll tell you how many times. I called you twice in the past month. Once to ask if you could help me understand why my internet wasn't working, and once to ask if you'd come with me to a doctor's appointment because I was nervous about what they might tell me. 2 phone calls in 30 days, and you consider that constant contact that's burdening your family." "Dad, it's not just about the phone calls." "You're right. It's also about the one time I stopped by unannounced because I was in your neighborhood and hoped to see my grandchildren for a few minutes. one unscheduled visit in a month, and that apparently constitutes me expecting you to drop everything whenever I need help." I could hear her breathing getting shallower, the way it did when she was getting upset, but trying not to show it. "But here's what's interesting," I continued. "In that same month where I was apparently burdening you with 2 phone calls and 1 visit, you used my credit card 37 times. 37 charges to my account while complaining that I was too needy. Those are different things. Are they? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the only time our relationship becomes burdensome is when I need something from you. When you need something from me, even if it's $1,500 for a weekend getaway I didn't know about until I saw the credit card statement. That's just family helping family." The conversation had shifted into territory neither of us had explored before. For years, ever since Margaret died, I'd been so grateful for any connection with Sarah's family that I'd accepted whatever terms they set. Phone calls when convenient for them, visits when they had time, help with technology or medical appointments only if it didn't interfere with their schedule. Meanwhile, my credit card was available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no questions asked. "Dad, I think you're mixing up 2 separate issues here. The money stuff and the boundaries stuff are completely different." Are they? Because the boundary you want to set is that I should need less from you. But there's no boundary on what you can take from me. That doesn't sound like a healthy relationship. That sounds like a transaction where one person provides resources and the other person decides how much contact they're willing to give in return. I heard David's voice more clearly now, asking Sarah what was going on. She covered the phone again, but not well enough to muffle her response. Dad's having some kind of crisis about the credit card. A crisis. Not a reasonable response to discovering that I'd been systematically taken advantage of, but a crisis. An overreaction from a confused old man who didn't understand the natural evolution of family financial arrangements. When she came back to the phone, her voice had the forced patience of someone dealing with an elderly relative who wasn't being rational. "Dad, I think maybe you're feeling overwhelmed right now. Grief affects people in different ways, and sometimes it can make us feel like people are taking advantage of us when they're really just trying to help." Grief. She was using my wife's death to explain away my objection to funding their lifestyle, as if missing Margaret had somehow impaired my ability to read a credit card statement or understand basic math. "Sarah, I want you to listen to me very carefully. This has nothing to do with grief and everything to do with respect. When you text me that I'm a burden while simultaneously spending my money without permission, that's not a grief issue. That's a respect issue." "We never spent your money without permission? When's the last time you asked permission before using that card?" Silence. "When's the last time you checked with me before making a purchase to see if I could afford it or if I thought it was necessary?" More silence. "That's what I thought. You stopped asking permission so long ago that you forgot it was my money you were spending." I could hear her crying now, soft sniffles that she was trying to hide. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to apologize for being so direct, to go back to the comfortable arrangement where I absorbed whatever treatment came my way in exchange for being allowed to remain part of their lives. But a larger part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since I'd made that call to the bank, knew that comfort would come at the cost of my own dignity. "I never meant to hurt you," she said through her tears. "I never thought of it as taking advantage. You're my dad, and I thought you wanted to help us. I did want to help you. I do want to help you. But help is supposed to be temporary assistance that enables people to get back on their feet. What we've been doing is me subsidizing your lifestyle while you complain about having to maintain a relationship with me." "That's not what we were doing." "Then explain to me what we were doing. Explain to me how spending over $4,000 a month of my money while texting me that I'm a burden makes sense in any relationship that's based on mutual respect." The crying got louder. "I don't know, Dad. I don't know how it got like this. Everything just became normal, and I stopped thinking about it, and maybe that was wrong, but I never meant to take advantage of you. Never meant to. The phrase that every person uses when they're caught doing something they know they shouldn't have been doing. I never meant to hurt anyone. I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant for you to find out. Sarah, intention matters, but impact matters more. You may not have intended to take advantage of me, But that's what happened. And when I started to object, your first response wasn't to apologize or change the behavior. Your first response was to tell me I was being a burden. I was frustrated. You were entitled. You'd gotten so used to having access to my money that when I started asking questions, you responded by attacking me for being needy. That's not frustration. That's entitlement. The word hung between us like a diagnosis neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Entitlement. The belief that you deserve something without having to earn it or ask for it, or even acknowledge that it's a gift rather than a right. I'm not entitled, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Sarah, you spent over $200 at Costco on Sunday. 2 days after texting me that I was a burden, you used my credit card for a bulk shopping trip. If that's not entitlement, what would you call it? I didn't think about the timing. You didn't think about it because you've stopped thinking about it as my money. It became your money in your mind, and my requests for basic family contact became unreasonable demands on your time. I walked back to Margaret's chair and sat down, suddenly feeling the weight of my 78 years. This conversation was exhausting, but it was also necessary. For 2 years, I'd been trying to figure out how to be a widower without losing my connection to the family Margaret and I had built together. But somewhere along the way, I'd confused staying connected with being useful. I'd mistaken being needed financially for being wanted personally. Dad, Sarah said, her voice small and uncertain, what happens now? I mean, with us, with our relationship. It was a fair question. We'd crossed a line tonight that we couldn't uncross. I'd stopped being the accommodating father who accepted whatever terms were offered, and she'd stopped being able to pretend that our relationship was anything other than transactional. The question was whether we could build something healthier from the wreckage of what we'd been doing. That depends, I said, on whether you want a relationship or a transaction. I want a relationship. Of course I want a relationship. Then we need to start over. Real boundaries this time. Real conversations about money before it gets spent. Real consideration for each other's needs instead of one person giving everything and the other person taking whatever they want. Okay, she said quickly. Yes, we can do that. We can definitely do that. But I could hear the fear in her voice. Not fear of losing her father, but fear of losing her father's financial support. And that told me everything I needed to know about how long this new arrangement would last once the immediate crisis passed. We'll see, I said. Actions matter more than promises, Sarah. We'll see what your actions tell me about what you actually want. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet house and tried to imagine what Margaret would think of the conversation I'd just had. She'd always been better at reading people's motivations, better at seeing through the polite facades to the calculations underneath. She'd probably seen this dynamic developing long before I did. But she also would have been heartbroken, not just because Sarah had taken advantage of my generosity, but because I'd allowed loneliness to make me so desperate for connection that I'd stopped requiring basic respect in exchange for my support. My phone buzzed with a text message, not from Sarah this time, but from David. Tom, Sarah told me about the credit card situation. I want you to know that we never intended to take advantage of your generosity. We got comfortable with the arrangement and stopped being as mindful as we should have been. We'll figure out our own financial situation going forward, and we hope this doesn't damage our relationship permanently. I read it twice, looking for the apology that wasn't there. Acknowledging that they'd gotten comfortable wasn't the same as apologizing for taking advantage. Saying they'd figure out their own financial situation wasn't the same as expressing gratitude for 2.5 years of subsidizing their lifestyle. And hoping it wouldn't damage our relationship permanently put the responsibility on me to get over it rather than on them to make it right. I deleted the message without responding and turned off my phone. Tomorrow would bring more conversations, more attempts to negotiate a return to the comfortable arrangement where my money was available, but my emotional needs were burdensome. But tonight, I was done talking. I walked to the kitchen and made myself a sandwich, eating it slowly while I thought about what I'd learned. Not just about Sarah and David, but about myself. About how grief and loneliness could make you so grateful for crumbs of attention that you stopped noticing you were being treated like a convenience rather than a person. The house felt different now. Not empty the way it had felt for 2 years, but quiet in a way that felt chosen rather than imposed. I'd been so afraid of being alone that I'd accepted being used instead. But there were worse things than solitude. Being disrespected was worse. Being taken for granted was worse. Being called a burden by people who treated you like a personal bank account was definitely worse. I finished my sandwich and went to bed in the room I'd shared with Margaret for 41 years, sleeping better than I had in months. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is to stop enabling them to treat you badly. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to remember that your worth isn't determined by how useful you are to people who can't be bothered to treat you with basic consideration. Tomorrow I'd start figuring out what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to have with a daughter who'd called me a burden while spending my money. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, I fell asleep feeling like I had some control over my own life. The freedom was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. The next morning brought a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I woke up naturally, without the anxiety that had been my constant companion since Margaret died. No wondering if I'd missed an important call from Sarah. No checking my phone for messages that might require immediate attention or financial assistance. Just the simple pleasure of morning coffee in a house where I could think my own thoughts without worrying about being a burden to anyone. I was reading the newspaper when my phone started ringing at 8:30. Sarah's name on the display, right on schedule. She'd probably discovered the credit card was declined when she tried to buy her usual expensive coffee on the way to work. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, then played back her message. Dad, something's wrong with the card. It got declined at Starbucks this morning, and I'm mortified. The people behind me in line were getting impatient, and I had to use my debit card instead. Can you call the bank and see what happened? Maybe there's a technical issue or something. Technical issue. As if the card had malfunctioned rather than being deliberately canceled by the man whose money she'd been spending. Even now, faced with the consequence of our conversation, she was looking for explanations that didn't require her to acknowledge what had actually happened. The second call came an hour later. This time, I answered, curious to see how long it would take her to connect the dots between our conversation last night and her card being declined this morning. Dad, thank God. Did you get my message about the card? I tried calling the bank, but they said I'd need to speak with the primary account holder. Can you call them and straighten this out? There's nothing to straighten out, I said calmly. I told you last night that I canceled the card. It's working exactly as intended. But Dad, I thought you were just upset and needed to blow off steam. I didn't think you'd actually cancel it without talking to us first. Without talking to you first. The woman who'd spent $23,000 without talking to me first was offended that I'd canceled my own credit card without consulting her. The audacity was breathtaking, but I was beginning to understand that audacity was what happened when someone got so comfortable taking advantage of your generosity that they started to see it as their right rather than your choice. Sarah, we did talk about it last night. I explained that I was implementing financial boundaries and you seemed to understand. I thought you meant we'd discuss better ways to use the card, not that you'd just take it away completely. Better ways to use the card. She was still operating under the assumption that she should have access to my money, just with improved guidelines about how to spend it. The idea that she might not be entitled to spend my money at all apparently hadn't occurred to her. The better way to use the card is for you to use your own money instead. Dad, you're being unreasonable. What if we have a real emergency? What if something happens with the kids and we need money immediately? Then you'll call me and ask for help, like families do when they respect each other enough to ask permission before spending someone else's money. I could hear her frustration building, the tone of someone who was accustomed to getting their way through persistence and emotional manipulation. This is punishment, Dad. You're punishing us for being honest about needing boundaries. Punishment. I was punishing them by stopping my financial support after they'd called me a burden. The logic was twisted, but it revealed everything about how she'd come to think about our relationship. My money was something she deserved. My emotional needs were something she shouldn't have to deal with. When I tried to rebalance that equation, it felt like punishment to her because she'd gotten so used to the arrangement being entirely in her favor. Sarah, let me ask you something. If your neighbor came to you and said, I've been paying your grocery bills for 3 years, but you never invite me over or call to check on me, and when I do come by, you act like I'm bothering you. What would you think about that situation? It's not the same thing. We're family. You're right. Family should treat each other better than that, not worse. The silence stretched long enough that I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had taken on the careful tone of someone trying a different approach. Dad, I know we've gotten off track somewhere, and I take responsibility for that. But cutting us off completely isn't the answer. What if we set up a system where we ask permission before using the card? Would that work? Ask permission. It was progress, I supposed, that she'd acknowledged the concept of permission at all. But it was also telling that her solution involved keeping the card rather than learning to live without my financial support. Sarah, the card is canceled. That's not changing. If you need help with a genuine emergency, you can call and ask, and I'll decide whether and how to help based on the specific situation. But that's so inconvenient. What if it's after business hours and the banks are closed? What if we need money immediately and can't wait for you to transfer funds? Inconvenient. Having to ask her father for permission before spending his money would be inconvenient. The word choice told me everything about how she'd come to view our financial arrangement. It was supposed to be convenient for her, regardless of how convenient it was for me to fund her lifestyle on a fixed income. Sarah, other families manage emergencies without having unlimited access to their parents' credit cards. You'll figure it out. Other families don't have parents who can afford to help. There it was. The assumption that because I could afford to help, I should be required to help, regardless of how I was treated in return. The belief that my financial capacity created an obligation that trumped basic considerations like respect or gratitude or even common courtesy. I can afford a lot of things, I said. That doesn't mean I'm obligated to pay for all of them. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Sarah cycling through different approaches, logical arguments about financial security, emotional appeals about the grandchildren, veiled threats about limiting my access to the family if I didn't restore the card. Each tactic revealed more about how she'd learned to manage me over the years and how successful those tactics had been in getting her what she wanted. But something had shifted in me since yesterday. Maybe it was the clarity that came from finally seeing the situation honestly. Maybe it was the relief of taking action instead of just absorbing whatever treatment came my way. Or maybe it was the realization that being alone was preferable to being used. Whatever it was, none of her familiar manipulation strategies had their usual effect. When she finally hung up, frustrated by my refusal to negotiate a return to the status quo, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pride. Not the shallow pride that comes from being needed, but the deeper satisfaction that comes from standing up for yourself when people are treating you badly. My phone buzzed with a text from David an hour later. Tom, I understand you're upset about the credit card spending, and you have every right to be concerned about your finances. But canceling the card without warning puts us in a difficult position. Sarah is really upset, and the kids are asking why Grandpa is angry with them. Can we work something out that addresses your concerns while still providing some security for emergencies? The message was more thoughtful than Sarah's approach, but it contained the same fundamental assumption, that I should provide financial security for their family, with the only question being how to structure that support in a way that addressed my concerns. Not whether I should be providing that support at all, but how to do it in a way that made me feel better about being taken advantage of. The reference to the kids was particularly manipulative, as if my financial boundaries were hurting my grandchildren rather than teaching their parents to take responsibility for their own family's security. As if the real problem was my decision to stop enabling their parents rather than their parents' decision to live beyond their means using someone else's money. I didn't respond to David's text. Instead, I spent the afternoon doing something I hadn't done in months. I enjoyed my own company. I read a book without interruption. I made myself a nice lunch and ate it slowly, without rushing to answer phone calls or respond to messages about other people's problems. I took a walk around the neighborhood and noticed things I'd been too distracted to see before. Mrs. Patterson next door was working in her garden, and we had a pleasant conversation about her roses. She didn't ask me for money or make me feel guilty for existing. She just talked to me like a person whose company she enjoyed, rather than someone whose usefulness she was evaluating. It was remarkable how good that felt. When I got home, there were 3 more voicemails from Sarah, each one escalating in desperation and anger. The first was another attempt at negotiation. The second was crying about how I was destroying our family over money. The third was pure fury, accusing me of being selfish and cruel and threatening to cut off my access to the grandchildren if I didn't restore their financial access to my accounts. I deleted all 3 without calling back. Threats had been her last resort for years, and I'd always given in because I was terrified of losing what little connection I had to her family. But threats only worked when the person being threatened valued what they might lose more than they valued their own dignity. And my perspective on that balance had shifted dramatically in the past 24 hours. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Margaret died. I called my sister Rose in Phoenix and had a long, honest conversation about what had been happening with Sarah. Rose had always been more direct than me, less willing to make excuses for people's bad behavior, even when those people were family. "Tommy," she said, using the nickname she'd called me since we were kids, "I've been worried about this for months. Every time we talked, you mentioned some new expense you were covering for them, and you always sounded so grateful that they were letting you help. It didn't sound healthy." "I was lonely," I admitted. "After Margaret died, I was so afraid of losing the only family I had left that I let them treat me however they wanted, as long as they didn't cut me off completely." "And how did that work out for you?" I laughed, surprising myself. "They cut me off anyway, or tried to. Turns out calling someone a burden while spending their money isn't a sustainable long-term strategy." Rose was quiet for a moment. "You know, Mom always said that people will treat you exactly as badly as you let them. She used to say that about Dad's brother Uncle Frank, remember? How he'd show up broke and asking for money, and Dad would always give it to him, and Uncle Frank never changed his behavior because he never had to face any consequences." I did remember. Uncle Frank had borrowed money from my father for years, always promising to pay it back, never following through, always having a new crisis that required immediate financial assistance. My father had enabled it until the day he died, and Uncle Frank had continued being irresponsible until the day he died, because someone had always been there to bail him out. "So what do I do now?" I asked Rose. "I mean, she's still my daughter. I still love her, even if I don't like how she's been treating me." "You love her enough to stop enabling her to be someone you can't respect," Rose said. "That's what real love looks like sometimes, not giving people what they want, but helping them become people who don't need to take advantage of others to get what they need." After I hung up with Rose, I sat in Margaret's chair and thought about the difference between loving someone and enabling them. For 2 years, I'd confused the two, thinking that love meant absorbing whatever treatment people gave me as long as it meant staying connected to them. But maybe love sometimes meant caring enough about someone to stop participating in their worst behaviors, even if it meant risking the relationship. My phone rang one more time that night. Sarah again, probably making one final attempt to restore the financial arrangement that had worked so well for her family. This time I answered, but not because I was ready to negotiate. "Dad, please, I've been thinking about everything you said, and you're right. We did take advantage of your generosity, and I'm sorry. But please don't let this destroy our family. The kids are asking about you, and I don't know what to tell them. Tell them that Grandpa loves them very much, and that grown-ups sometimes need to have difficult conversations about how to treat each other with respect." "But what about the money situation? I mean, going forward, how do we handle emergencies?" Even her apology circled back to money. Even when acknowledging that she'd taken advantage of me, she was still focused on restoring her access to my financial resources. It was like she couldn't conceive of a relationship with me that didn't include my money. "Sarah, for the next year, you handle emergencies the way every other family handles them. With your own resources, with credit cards in your own names, with loans from banks, with help from David's parents, with whatever solution doesn't involve me. And during that year, we'll see if you can learn to value our relationship for reasons that have nothing to do with my bank account." "A whole year? Dad, that's not realistic. What if something really serious happens?" "Then you'll call me, explain the situation, and ask for specific help with the specific problem. And I'll decide whether to help based on the situation and how you've been treating me. But the days of unlimited access to my money while treating me like a burden are over." "But I apologized for calling you a burden. Can't we move past this? Apologized. She'd acknowledged that the word was hurtful, but she hadn't actually apologized for the sentiment behind it. She'd apologized for getting caught taking advantage of me, not for taking advantage of me. She'd apologized for saying I was a burden, not for treating me like one. Actions matter more than apologies, Sarah. Show me that you value our relationship for reasons beyond my ability to pay for things, and maybe we can rebuild something healthier than what we had. And if I can't? If I can't prove whatever it is you think I need to prove? It was a fair question, and I gave her an honest answer. Then we'll both know where we really stand with each other, and we can make decisions based on that truth, instead of pretending we have a relationship we don't actually have. After I hung up, I realized that for the first time in 2 years, I felt like myself again. Not the grateful, accommodating widower who was so afraid of being alone that he'd accept any treatment as long as it came with occasional family contact. But Tom Henderson, the man who'd worked hard his whole life, who'd loved his wife deeply, who'd raised a daughter and deserved to be treated with basic respect by the people he'd sacrificed for. Margaret would have been proud of me for finally standing up for myself. She'd always said I was too generous for my own good, too willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, long after they'd shown me who they really were. But she'd also said that being kind didn't mean being weak, and being loving didn't mean being a doormat. I was finally learning the difference. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Sarah would probably try different approaches to restore the financial arrangement that had worked so well for her. David might get more involved, using his charm and reasonableness to negotiate a compromise that gave them most of what they wanted while making me feel like I'd won something. The grandchildren might be used as leverage, their relationship with me held hostage until I agreed to resume funding their parents' lifestyle. But I was ready for those challenges now in a way I hadn't been before, because I'd remembered something crucial that grief had made me forget. My worth wasn't determined by how useful I was to other people. My value didn't depend on my ability to solve other people's problems or fund other people's choices. I was worth treating with respect simply because I was a human being who had loved deeply and lived honestly, and deserved better than being called a burden by people who couldn't be bothered to earn the money they were spending. The house felt peaceful as I turned off the lights and headed to bed. Not empty, but calm. Not lonely, but independent. For the first time since Margaret died, I was looking forward to tomorrow, curious about what I might discover about myself when I wasn't spending all my energy trying to purchase other people's affection. Change was frightening, but it was also liberating. And sometimes the most loving thing you could do for people was to stop enabling them to treat you badly, even if they called that cruelty instead of recognizing it as the gift it actually was.